The first time my neighbor parked in my driveway, I honestly thought it was a mistake. The second time, I thought maybe she was having a rough day. By the third time, I realized something a lot of homeowners eventually learn the hard way. Some people don't see your boundaries as real unless crossing them costs them something. Back in 2021, I bought my first house in a suburb outside Raleigh, North Carolina. Nothing fancy, just a small brick ranch at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac with a narrow driveway, a one-car garage, and enough yard space for a grill and a couple lawn chairs. To most people, it probably looked ordinary, but to me it felt like the biggest achievement of my life. I was 34 years old and had spent more than a decade bouncing between apartments. Every overtime shift, every vacation I skipped, every weekend I spent working side jobs instead of going out with friends had somehow turned into that little house. And maybe that's why what happened next got under my skin so badly. Directly across the street lived a woman named Carol Whitaker. Now, if you've ever lived in a suburban neighborhood, you know there's always one family that somehow owns more vehicles than should physically fit on their property. Carol's family was that family. Her husband Greg drove a giant lifted F-250. Their adult son had a work van. There was an aging fishing boat parked beside the house. A utility trailer sat half on the grass. And then there was Carol's silver Toyota Camry, which seemed to migrate around the neighborhood like a lost shopping cart. The strange thing was that they actually had enough space. The problem was their garage. You couldn't even call it a garage anymore. It looked more like an archaeological dig site. Boxes stacked to the ceiling. Broken furniture. Holiday decorations from years nobody could remember. Old exercise equipment gathering dust. Every time the garage door opened, it looked like the entire contents of a storage unit were trying to escape. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Then, one Tuesday evening, I came home from work and found Carol's Camry sitting right in the middle of my driveway. Not partially, not accidentally, completely parked. I remember staring at it through my windshield, wondering if I had somehow missed a neighborhood emergency. Maybe her driveway was blocked. Maybe someone was visiting. Maybe there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. So I kept it friendly. I wrote a short note. Please don't park in my driveway. Thanks. Simple. Polite. No attitude. When I looked outside 20 minutes later, the car was gone. Problem solved. Or so I thought. 3 days later, it happened again. Same car. Same spot. This time I walked across the street and knocked on her front door. Carol answered holding a glass of white wine. She smiled like we were old friends. "Hey, Carol," I said. "I noticed your car is in my driveway again." She actually laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not embarrassed laughter. The kind of laugh people make when they think you're being unreasonable. "Oh, honey," she said, waving her hand. "I was only there for a minute. Now here's the thing. My doorbell camera covered the entire driveway. She'd been parked there for almost an hour. But what bothered me wasn't the lie. It was how casually she said it. Like my property existing for her convenience was the most normal thing in the world. After that, I started paying attention. And once I started paying attention, I couldn't stop noticing it. Carol never asked, never apologized, never acknowledged she was doing anything wrong. She'd pull into my driveway, grab her purse, slam the door, and walk into her house without so much as a glance in my direction. Like the driveway belonged to the neighborhood. Like ownership was just a suggestion. Then one Saturday morning, everything changed. I was making coffee when I heard tires outside. I looked through the kitchen blinds and watched Carol pull into my driveway yet again. But this time something caught my attention. Her driveway was completely empty. Not full. Not blocked. Empty. She wasn't parking in my driveway because she had nowhere else to go. She was parking there because she didn't feel like moving one of her family's vehicles. And, standing there in my kitchen, coffee mug in hand, I felt something shift. This wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't absent-mindedness. It was entitlement. And the moment I realized that, I stopped thinking about Carol as a difficult neighbor. I started thinking about her as a problem that needed a solution. What Carol didn't know was that I had already begun documenting every single incident. Photos, timestamps, camera footage, notes. And over the next few weeks, I was about to discover something that would completely change the way I handled difficult people for the rest of my life. The funny thing about entitled people is that they almost always think everyone else operates the way they do. They assume you're going to get emotional. They assume you're going to yell. They assume you're eventually going to give up because keeping the peace feels easier than enforcing a boundary. And for a little while, Carol probably thought exactly that. What she didn't realize was that I'd quietly stopped arguing and started collecting evidence. Every time her Camry touched my driveway, I logged it. Date, time, duration, photo, video, clip. At first it felt ridiculous. I remember sitting in my dining room table one night updating a spreadsheet and actually laughing at myself. Who keeps a parking spreadsheet? Apparently I did. But once someone lies to your face while a camera records the truth, you learn pretty quickly that memory doesn't matter. Documentation does. The strange part was how comfortable Carol seemed becoming. Sometimes she'd wave at me after parking there. Other times she'd smile and ask how my weekend was going while her car sat 20 feet behind me on property she didn't own. It was almost impressive, like she'd somehow convinced herself there was nothing wrong with what she was doing. Meanwhile, I spent several evenings researching local property laws. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, I wanted clarity. I wanted to know exactly where the line was. What I discovered changed everything. North Carolina law was surprisingly straightforward when it came to unauthorized vehicles on private residential property. The catch was that homeowners had to follow procedure carefully. No emotional outbursts. No impulsive decisions. No cowboy justice. Everything had to be documented. Everything had to be visible. Everything had to be done correctly. And I love that, because systems don't care about feelings. Systems care about records. So I made a decision. If Carol wanted to turn this into a process, I'd become very good at following processes. The following Monday, I ordered 2 reflective signs. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. Bright red lettering. Impossible to miss. I installed one near the garage and another beside the entrance to the driveway. Then I contacted a licensed towing company that worked with residential properties. The manager was a guy named Vince. When I explained the situation, there was a long pause. Then he laughed. "Let me guess," he said. "Neighbor thinks your driveway is community property?" "Pretty much. Yeah, we get those calls more often than you'd think." He walked me through every requirement. We verified the signage, completed the authorization paperwork, documented everything. The entire process took less than an hour. And after I hung up, I remember feeling surprisingly calm. For the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't frustrated anymore. Because now there was a system. And systems are predictable. People aren't. 4 days later, Carol parked in my driveway again. I wish I could tell you she noticed the signs and reconsidered. She didn't. I watched from my kitchen window as she pulled in, grabbed 2 grocery bags from the passenger seat, and walked toward her front door. She never even looked at the signs. Not once. That level of confidence is almost fascinating. It's like consequences simply didn't exist in her version of reality. I waited until her front door closed. Then I picked up my phone. Raleigh Recovery Services. "Hey, Ivince. It's happening." His response came immediately. "We'll be there shortly." 25 minutes later, a tow truck rolled into the cul-de-sac. I won't lie. There was something oddly satisfying about hearing those hydraulic lifts moving into position. Not because I enjoyed seeing someone punished, but because after weeks of being ignored, reality was finally entering the conversation. The driver worked quickly. Within minutes, the Camry was off my property. Gone. Clean. Efficient. No drama. About an hour later, my doorbell rang. Violently. I opened the door and found Carol standing on my porch. Her face was bright red. "What did you do?" she demanded. I leaned against the doorway. "What do you mean?" "My car is gone." I nodded. "Yeah, you had it towed?" I shrugged. "Looks that way." The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then came the explosion. "You can't do that." I almost laughed. The sign was still visible over my shoulder. "You mean the signs that say unauthorized vehicles will be towed?" Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I was only there for a little while. "There it is," I said. "What?" "Every single time." She frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Every time you park there, it's always only for a little while." For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely uncertain. Not guilty, just surprised. Like nobody had ever challenged the logic before. Then she tried another angle. We've lived here longer than you. I blinked. What does that have to do with anything? This neighborhood has always shared things. Shared things. I actually remember staring at her because I couldn't believe she had said it out loud. A driveway. A private driveway. Shared. The more she talked, the more I started understanding something. Carol didn't think she was breaking a rule. She genuinely believed her convenience outweighed ownership. Somewhere along the way, she'd rewritten reality to make herself the reasonable person. Eventually, she threatened to call the police. I handed her copies of the paperwork, the towing authorization, the warning documentation, photographs, everything. Her confidence evaporated. Not all at once. Slowly, like air leaking from a balloon. She stared at the papers, then stared at me, then back at the papers. For a moment, I thought she might apologize. She didn't. Instead, she muttered something about me being petty and stormed away. The next day, I learned she'd paid nearly $300 to recover the car. 2 days later, I learned the total had climbed closer to $400 because she'd waited before picking it up. And for a while, peace returned. The driveway stayed empty. The neighborhood felt normal again. Every evening, I'd pull into my driveway and feel a strange sense of relief. Not because I'd won anything, because the problem seemed over. Unfortunately, entitlement rarely disappears after one consequence. Sometimes people convince themselves the first disaster was just bad luck. 3 weeks later, I came home from work and saw something sitting in my driveway that made me stop the truck in the middle of the street. The silver Camry. Again, same car, same spot, like nothing had happened. And in that moment, I realized Carol wasn't testing my patience anymore. She was testing whether I would really enforce the boundary a second time. What happened next ended up costing her far more than money. The second time I called the tow company, I didn't feel angry. That was probably the strangest part. A few months earlier, seeing Carol's car in my driveway would have ruined my entire evening. My blood pressure would spike, I'd replay imaginary arguments in my head, and I'd spend hours thinking about all the things I wished I'd said. But by then, it felt like paying a utility bill. I parked my truck, walked inside, set my keys on the counter. Then I called Vince. When he answered, there was a brief pause. Then he laughed. No way. Yep. The Camry again? The Camry again. His laughter got louder. We'll send somebody. I poured myself a cup of coffee while I waited. That probably sounds cold, but something had changed inside me. I wasn't fighting Carol anymore. I wasn't trying to teach her a lesson. I wasn't trying to win. I was simply allowing consequences to do their job. The tow truck arrived about 20 minutes later. The car disappeared, and I went back to watching a documentary about restoring vintage motorcycles. That was it. No excitement. No celebración. Just cause and effect. The fallout, however, was much worse for Carol. Apparently, Greg needed both of their trucks that afternoon for work, which meant she had no transportation. She ended up taking an Uber across town to retrieve the car, then another one home. And because life occasionally has a wicked sense of humor, she'd left several bags of groceries in the back seat. Frozen food, ice cream, the works. I actually saw her walking back up the street later that evening, carrying grocery bags that looked considerably lighter than they had a few hours earlier. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She looked embarrassed. And there's a huge difference. Angry people still think they're right. Embarrassed people are starting to realize everyone else sees the situation differently than they do. That was the moment I thought maybe she'd finally learned. Turns out I was almost right. Almost. Over the next couple weeks, word spread through the neighborhood. Not because I told people, because neighborhoods operate on gossip the same way small towns operate on weather. People notice things. Tow trucks, arguments, sudden changes in behavior. Soon enough, a few neighbors started asking questions. When I explained what had happened, every single person reacted the same way. Wait, she was parking your driveway? Not one person defended her. Not one. And honestly, that seemed to bother Carol more than the towing fees. Because suddenly the story wasn't about a mean neighbor towing a car. It was about a homeowner protecting his property. The public narrative had shifted. And once that happens, it's very difficult to shift it back. For a while, things stayed quiet. Then one afternoon, Months after the first incident, I looked outside and nearly laughed out loud. The Camry was back. Again. At that point, I genuinely wondered whether this was some kind of psychological condition. Maybe she couldn't help herself. Maybe she convinced herself enough time had passed. Maybe she thought I wouldn't notice. To this day, I have no idea. What I do know is that I didn't even walk to the window. I saw enough. I picked up my phone, called Vince, confirmed the vehicle, and went right back to what I was doing. No speech, no confrontation, no warning, just procedure. The third tow happened faster than the first two. The driver already knew the address. Everybody knew the address. And strangely enough, that third tow ended everything. Completely. No more driveway parking. No more excuses. No more confrontations at my front door. No more passive-aggressive smiles. Nothing. Carol simply stopped. Over the following months, she avoided eye contact whenever we happened to be outside at the same time. If I checked my mailbox, she'd suddenly become fascinated with her flower beds. If I walked to the curb, she'd find a reason to go back inside. It was like the woman who once treated my driveway as public property suddenly couldn't bear to acknowledge it existed. Later, I did some rough math. Between towing charges, storage fees, Uber rides, spoiled groceries, and time lost dealing with everything, Carol probably spent somewhere between $800 and $1,000. All because she didn't want to walk an extra 20 feet from her own driveway. And looking back now, the craziest part is that none of this was really about parking. Not really. The driveway was just the stage. The actual conflict was respect. Because when someone repeatedly ignores a boundary you've clearly communicated, they're not saying they need your property. They're saying their convenience matters more than your rights. That's why situations like this bother people so deeply. It stops being about concrete, parking spaces, fences, or property lines. It becomes personal. What I learned from Carol completely changed the way I deal with difficult people. Most of us are taught that keeping the peace is always the mature option, and usually it is. But there comes a point where avoiding conflict accidentally rewards bad behavior. There comes a point where patience starts looking exactly like permission. That's the trap. And once people believe there are no consequences, they keep pushing a little farther every time. What finally solved my problem wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't some dramatic neighborhood showdown. It was consistency. It was structure. It was allowing consequences to become automatic instead of emotional. The moment I stopped arguing and started enforcing, everything changed. Sometimes the strongest move isn't yelling louder. Sometimes it's quietly learning the rules better than the person trying to ignore them. And honestly, that's a lesson I've carried into every difficult relationship since then. Now here's what I'm curious about. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have called the tow company after the very first warning? Would you have given Carol more chances than I did? Or do you think towing her car 3 separate times was going too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I have a feeling this is one of those situations where reasonable people can completely disagree. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who thought your property belonged to them, I want to hear that story too. Trust me, after everything that happened on that little cul-de-sac, I'm convinced neighborhood drama is one of the strangest forms of human nature you'll ever witness.